Why do we experience chaos and how is it connected to our purpose? Our guest today is Gary Harpst, and I'm really excited to have him here. He's got 4 decades of experience in leadership and building businesses. He's founded 3 successful businesses, one of which merged and then was sold later to Microsoft. He is the CEO of Lead First, and he is the author of the groundbreaking book, Built to Beat Chaos. Now, if you want a book that is an in-depth look at what it means to build a kingdom business and to beat chaos and to really understand how to be an effective leader, this is an excellent book. And I say it's groundbreaking because much of what he's talking about in there, I haven't read anywhere else. And I've read a lot of books. And so I would highly recommend that you check it out. And today we're going to talk about biblical principles of great leadership, how Gary has fused his faith and business expertise. And we're going to talk about the 3 levels of care for a whole business, whole person health strategy for success. Gary, welcome to the Leaders Transformation. We're glad you're here.
No, thank you, Nicole. This is going to be fun. I like to be a little bit of a contrarian, so hopefully we've got some of that in here.
I think we will. I think we will. So before we start, I do want to do a shout out to the team at Interview Valet. Tom and Karen Schwab have built an incredible team there. They're fantastic. And they have been actually huge supporters of this show for many years. And it is the reason why we have a lot of amazing guests, is largely because that they have sent us some amazing clients of theirs. And so we appreciate them so much. So special thanks to Interview Valet. So, yeah. So let's talk about it, Gary. Let's talk, first of all, about chaos and how you would define chaos.
Well, I define it differently than I used to. And I think I used to think of myself as chaos was a condition going on around me that I was a victim of. And in fact, we heard that a lot with clients. And once the word, I started picking up on the word, I began to realize you hear it every day. I mean, literally, in today's society, everybody's talking about it. My kids, my grandkids, chaos. And what had changed my mind about chaos and actually caused me to write this book was I was reading I have a biblical worldview. Now, everybody believes in something, and my faith is in that there is a creator, and there's in the Bible is revealed the way things were created. I happen to be an engineer, so I look for engineering principles and requirements. Well, in the creation account, there's a place in there where it says that humanity was created in God's image to the word is have dominion or rule, but it is used all through the Bible, from first book to the last, and sometimes it's called bringing order, or other times it's called ruling, like a king would rule. Sometimes it's called overcoming. So that the concept is not being a victim, but being proactive. But here's the connection. I was reading that one day, and I thought, well, if I'm created to be like God, what do I know about God at this point? Because it was really on the first page of the Bible. And so you don't know much about God. So I went back to the beginning and said, what has he revealed about himself here? And ask somebody someday, what's the very first thing God created? If they happen to be familiar with the Bible, most people will say light in the creation story. Well, if you read it carefully, that's not what he created first. In the very first sentence, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and they were void and without form. Well, that's another definition of chaos. And then it, like a light bulb, went on to say, I'm created like God. And what is God showing me? He's showing me that chaos isn't evil. He created it. God is not evil. He created it. And then he started to bring order out of it. And all of a sudden, it was like this epiphany that chaos really is a resource. If we don't have things around us to work with, which we label as chaos, then we have nothing to do. And so the book is titled Built to Beat Chaos. And the encouraging words I think, or the principles behind this are, if you're in a place of chaos, think differently. And we'll talk further in this episode about how to do that. But that's what chaos is really raw resource that we can reorder for purpose.
Well, and when I was reading your book, I loved that approach, because so often we're trying to avoid chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we at the same time will say the bigger the problem, the greater the people people in theory, the people that solve the biggest problems in the world get paid the most. I say in theory because it doesn't entirely work that way, but because there's some people that are incredible and save lives and don't get paid a lot for that. But the idea is that the bigger the problem, the bigger the opportunity. And yet at the same time, here we are trying to avoid chaos and make everything, you saw it in the pandemic, like all of a sudden things change, there's uncertainty, and everybody's like, no, we want to go back to normal. We want to go back to the way it was. It's like this order that we thought we had. When there's such a huge opportunity, as you say. And I love what you described there in terms of how chaos is connected to our purpose. Can you dive a little bit more into detail on that?
Yes, again, I am an engineer. So in engineering parlance, we look for design requirements. When you go to a customer and say, this house, what is this house you want to look like? What do you want? How many bedrooms? What's the size of your family? Those are requirements. Once you get requirements straight, then you go into design. And the design is only as good as the requirements. Okay. So a lot of people talk about purpose, but it's a much more complex topic than we talk like we have a purpose, like there's one purpose. And that's just simply not true. And I happen to be sitting in a Stickley chair right now. Stickley is a handmade furniture, I don't know, third, fourth generation from New York. And if I were to approach the creator of this chair and ask him what's the purpose of the chair, you could get quite a variety of answers. You could get an answer that says, well, the chair is for somebody to sit in. That's what, obviously. Or you could get a completely different point of view, which is, I make these chairs so that I can feed my family. Two very different answers about what is purpose. So when humans are thinking about purpose, you have to start with, do you believe you were created or not? If you believe you were created, then there's a designer who had something in mind in putting you together. And so I'm in that worldview where I believe I'm created. And so when you ask me what purpose is all about, purpose is the way you bring order out of chaos. And so a silly example, we built a home in the woods 30, 40 years ago, my wife and I, and they brought up loads of lumber and stuff scattered all over the field, and it looked like chaos. But then a guy walks up with a blueprint, and all of a sudden it's no longer chaos. Okay, this 2x4 goes here, this thing goes there. And that's the way chaos is in our lives. If you're feeling like you're overwhelmed with chaos, then drop back to purpose. Reflect deeply on what your purpose is, or the purpose of the organization you're working on. And out of that will come insights on what to do next. The objective should not be to get rid of chaos. You can't get rid of it. You can only bring it under some control for your purpose.
I love that. Yeah, it's funny because as a coach like you, I know you consult to major companies and help companies work through these strategic issues and so forth. I remember, the people who come to me and they'd say, I want to grow my sales. I want to increase my profitability. And it's like, okay, got it. So we'll do that. But first, why are you in business? Was always my question. Like, why are we here? Because that is going to determine how, and oftentimes, like if you want to increase your sales, or you're struggling or stagnant or something's not working, you've somehow lost sight of likely your purpose.
A
you
bigger
know, and
purpose.
the
That's
bigger
right.
purpose of why you're here, and you got into the nitty gritty. I love this. What are
Well,
the,
and
yeah, go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, you're kind of getting at the essence or bringing some color to the idea of what it means to be a leader. Because I would say that the biblical answer to that question is you have to determine purpose, and then you have to align people to accomplish purpose. And leadership is holy work. And so your point about um, well, the point I want to make, building off of your point, is the nuances of determining purpose. In your example, you've got a sales manager or somebody, a senior person says, I've got to grow sales. This is what I want. Well, that purpose is within a bigger purpose, which is the mission of the organization. And so when you're determining purpose in your life, you have to align your purpose with the bigger purposes around you, or you're going against it. Now, sometimes you need to do that, but you better know that you're in for a fight if you do that, right? And so no amount of trying to grow sales will work if you're in the wrong market,
Yes.
right? Or if you have the
Yeah.
wrong strategy. If you're building a widget nobody wants,
Yeah. It's going to be a rough road. Yeah, for
yeah.
sure.
So you asked earlier my definition of chaos. There's really three types. And one is the stuff that's in insurance contracts, acts of God, earthquakes, volcanoes, those sorts of things that we can't control. Then there's the chaos that's between us. And that's what we probably mean most of the time when we say we're experiencing chaos. It has to do with relationships in our family, at work, not on the same page. But the far deepest and most challenging chaos is within us. And the truth is that most of the chaos we have externally and between people, really the root cause is within us. And so leaders, I make the point in the book. I didn't think of this stuff. It just comes to me when I'm was writing and praying about what to write. God has made a universe where things are made out of atoms, like this control I've got in my hand. And atoms work the same way every time. They have electromagnetic energy. We can study those rules and build whatever we want. But a leader has to put together components that don't obey the laws of physics. And those components are you and me and someone else. And so leadership is this amazingly holy calling, which is for us to have dominion as a human race, we have to work together to do it. And leaders have to be able to determine good purpose that aligns with the way things work. And they have to help work with people who are all different, all have different abilities, and somehow shape that into an organization, if you will, that can achieve that purpose. It's a high calling. And I don't mean just people that are managers. I mean, we all have to align purpose inside of us. We're all leaders in that definition.
Yeah. So where does somebody start in that process if they realize that they are there's chaos around them and in them?
Well, most people don't take the time to invest in thinking. I mean, it sounds like an obvious thing. I think Stephen Covey, what was it, 25 years ago, talked about big rocks, and once a week have a meeting with yourself for an hour and refresh your memory on what your big rocks are: my family, or this area of my life, my physical development. And that we need this refreshment process to reflect on our purposes. Otherwise, the day-to-day activities pull us farther and farther away from them. And so that's the first thing I would say to people is figure out in your schedule where you're going to have time to recenter yourself. And maybe the biblical model is take some rest on Sundays, but have some break in your routine. I believe that the scripture is so practical. It's not an isolated thing in church. It says on Sabbath in the biblical definition means to cease from what you've been doing. And it says that the Sabbath was created for us. The concept of taking a day off every 7 days is for us. And it's for us to reflect and think about what's important, break with all the other stuff going on. So that's one place to start. The next is, if you're in a group, get the group together and recenter on purpose, kind of like you're discussing about sales. If you've got a problem, that's a sign to step back and reflect on purpose. And maybe you have to go up a layer or 2 layers on reflecting on purpose. So
Yeah.
we're usually in such a big hurry, we think we don't have time to do that. And all it does is contribute to more chaos.
Yeah. In your book, you talk about mission and values. It's kind of along what we're talking about here, getting diluted with growth. So talk a little bit about that dynamic that happens as companies grow. Because I had a guest on, for some context, years ago, and Andrew Hewitt, and he was the one who created this Game Changers 500, a list of all these organizations, these companies that were doing amazing things in the world, the Whole Foods, the Tom Shoes, and whatever. And what he noticed is that as they went along a few years out, maybe they got bought out or whatever, is that they lost sight of their mission. Mm-hmm. They lost sight of the values to which they were originally subscribing to. And because they grew so big, right? And it's like we were talking about, you lose sight of the purpose. So talk about that dynamic that happens. And then of course, like we were talking about how to deal with that. But I know your book goes into some like more granular ways, specifically how you do that. And actually, even in that, maybe talk about the difference between purpose, mission, values, vision, and what those are, because there's a lot of words that get thrown around in this conversation when we talk about the why.
Before we talk about how, just a little bit of why behind it, and the reason the topic you're bringing up is so important. The frog in the kettle syndrome is, most of us don't notice the world we're in is changing. It changes slowly. And so entrepreneurs or people who start a business, by definition, the people that are in that startup phase are immersed in purpose from day one. Every conversation they have is them figuring out who we're selling and how we're building it. And there's this high percentage of time and energy is going to that whole team understanding purpose. And we went through this. We went from a 1-person organization to 500. And as time goes on and you bring more people on, there's less and less percentage of time and energy talking about purpose. And it's more and more about how to execute it. And we call this the execution paradox. It's the fact that every single organ or organization will eventually outgrow its own ability to execute. And the reason is, just do simple mathematics. If there's 3 people in a room or in an organization, there's only 3 potential interactions. If you increase that 3 to 25 or 24, that's an 8-fold increase in interactions, 117-fold permutations of interactions. So I know I'm not really speaking to the technique yet. I'm speaking to the leader of wake up. If you are growing an organization, the frog and the kettle is getting warmer and warmer. And every time you add a person to that organization, you are increasing the complexity it takes to manage it. Well, what this means is the guy who's in love with creating the first product or service or whatever it is, that person's job changes from building things to building people who understand why we're building things. And almost none of us get it. I didn't. And so to your point, what the answers I give are so basic. It's sort of like going on a fitness program. Why can't I be more fit? Well, exercise more, drink more water, and work out. I mean, right? Well, the answer to this problem of purpose is get the people in a room that need to understand this, spend time until they're one mind of what the purpose is, and then invest the time it takes to carry that message to others. And the problem is people do not want to invest the time. There's empirical evidence that shows the correlation of an individual's engagement is directly related to how much time their immediate supervisor spends with them.
Wow. Yeah. I remember
And
you
so,
said that you actually have a diagram in your book about that.
yes, that's
Talk a
right.
little bit about, yeah, that correlation.
Well,
Like where does it need to be, and where does it start to drop? Does it drop
well,
off
the
at some?
research shows that anywhere up to about 5 or 6 hours a week of one-on-one time will have a correlating increase in employee engagement, tenure, just engagement with the organization, satisfaction with working in the organization. After about 5 or 6 hours, it flattens off, the correlation. But it doesn't mean that I'm sitting across the desk having a one-on-one conversation. It means any interaction, like think of your children. My wife and I often talk about going to lunch with the kids, and if there's four of them, we don't have any quality conversation. But if we go one-on-one with them, we can hear what's really inside of them, and they can hear what's inside of us. So these one-on-one interactions can be a hallway conversation where you're listening to that person, you're asking for their ideas, you're treating them like they are created in the image of God, treat them with respect and care about them. Well, that takes time. And I mean, just really last week, I was in a planning session with one of our senior leaders, not in our company, but in a client, and their employee engagement went down significantly in the last year. And they've been growing through acquisition, et cetera. And it went down a lot. And I talked about this engagement thing. And you know what the response was? We do not have time to do that. And I said, well, what is your turnover? It's about 40%.
Wow.
I said, so what's your turnover costing you? Their turnover is costing them 10 times as much it would if they had a supervisor or enough supervisors to talk to their people. And so many of the answers to these things are not rocket science. They're just in the head of the leader. They've got to get the principle and believe that they've got to do something, just like a fitness. You know, my problem with fitness is not knowing what to do. My problem with fitness is doing it.
Yeah.
Sound like I'm preaching, don't I?
No, this brings up a really good point, because organizations that grow, you end up getting the multi-tiered approach, or like there's like level.
Yeah, diluted.
Yeah, it's diluted, and there's many levels of management.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing you say is that we think about managers, it's kind of like built into the word, but we think about managers as supporting execution of tasks and making sure that the tasks get done. But deeper underneath that, and maybe this is obvious, this is just kind of one of those like finer distinctions for me in terms of defining it, is the real role of a manager is for people to have the frequency of interaction with the people so that they can do the execution.
Yes.
And so why you have this, because I know a lot of times people go like, oh my gosh, there's just people managing people to manage people to manage people to get the thing done. You know, it's kind of like, what the heck? Yeah. Why do you need those managers? And how do you train them? Because most managers don't get training. They get training on maybe project management, but not people management.
Absolutely.
Right. So yeah, talk a little bit.
Yeah. So let me point something out that we talk about internally all the time. 85% of the workforce is not a manager. On the average, if you look across all industries, the ratio is about 1 to 5 or 1 to 6. And so what it really means is that the 85% of the work is getting done by people that are managed by a first level supervisor, not the middle and not the CEO. And who has the least management experience in the organization? the frontline supervisor. And how many of those people, this is their first job as a leader, and that they have grown up thinking their job is working in this part of the organization, putting hands on, and they have to change their view from me doing it, me hands on doing this, to I'm in a completely different role. That's a big transition to go through. And we feel like our organizations are failing at doing that. When we think of leadership development, we think of what do we do for the vice presidents, send them off to some camp somewhere to be better managers. When in reality, we believe that the operating system that the organization is using, the things that they use to manage the organization day to day, should be integrated with its leadership development system. And the two should feed off each other. And that's not the way the industries work. You go look for leadership development, and it's a whole industry of courses and things over here. You go look for operating systems, and their set of software over here. And we believe in this so much that we're actually putting them together into one platform. That's the business we've started recently because of the problem you're talking about. We're not reaching these 85%. We're not having the kind of impact we want. And this generation won't put up with it. They want relationships and they want purpose. And our leadership development systems are not delivering the kind of maturity that's needed to meet their needs.
Yeah. Well, I think about those first level managers then get promoted up and higher and higher and higher, and they become those VPs. And so I get why, the natural inclination is to, and I've said that to people. I've had colleagues say, we need to work with the managers and kind of start in the middle somewhere. And it's like, well, it doesn't really work that way, because if you have the top from the top are doing something completely different, and here you're like, hey, you should be doing it this way, and they're like, really? That's not what I see. So it does go with the top down, but it tends to trickle down and get dispersed. And so the most of the investment is at the top, as opposed to being evenly dispersed throughout. It's not an either or, it's a yes and, it's top down and bottom up to invest. I totally agree so that it's like investing in the future leaders with kids, right? We can wait until they're adults and messed up adults and then fix them, or we can help them when they're kids to really understand who they are and have confidence in who they are, and educate them equip them with the right skills and tools and critical thinking skills to be able to be effective, so that we can save ourselves a lot of time. So, but if you have an organization where things are happening at the top, so it's a yes. So it's a yes and versus
I'm glad you made that clarification, because by no means would I say you develop the bottom at the expense of the top. And I'm curious, your experience. We for years coached the executive teams, and frequently what we would get is this message, and we're very service oriented and try to satisfy the client. And they'd say, well, can you go fix manager such and such or so and so? And we found we're putting more and more energy into the organization doing what they should be doing.
Yeah. And
we actually disempowered them. We began to work around them instead of through them. And again, people probably get tired of my biblical perspective, but Jesus built a whole empire, if you will, really working with 12 people. And he taught those 12 to work with 12 more. And that's the principle of mentoring.
Yes.
And so to your point, we do start at the top, but we insist that what we're doing is building mentors, and that their job is not done until the front line is transformed.
I love that.
Yeah. And so we do start at the top. I mean, I contradicted what I said, but we don't think it works any other way. The way you develop the front lines is through the middle tiers. But we've had to put measurements in place and dashboards to prove that the frontline supervisors are really acting and behaving in a way that produces engagement. If they're not, talk to their manager.
Yeah. Oh, it's good. And not necessarily contradicting. It's just a distinction, because like you just described, there's so many times where I've, talk to somebody and they're like, I need you to come in and fix my team.
Yes.
And I'm like, really, let's talk about that. Let's get to know you and how you are as a leader. Well, I'm a good leader. And it's like, would you be open to me actually, let's doing a little survey. Let's find out,
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
it's usually a little bit different than that because of the self-awareness. We talk about
Yeah.
leading ourselves, the chaos within, and how important it is that we actually have a level of self-awareness to recognize what we don't know. I forget who it was on this show that said it recently and said, by the time you have this revelation as a leader, you're the last to know because everybody else already sees it. Something very eloquent around that, so this is good. Let's talk about the 3 levels of care and how do we integrate them into this business strategy. We've been kind of talking around it, but specifically like in terms of building a strategy for your business, how do you manage this in terms of investing in these 3 levels of care?
And the this came about as a result of we talked to faith-driven leaders about how do you integrate your belief system in a world that's multicultural, and that's the 3 levels you're speaking of.
Yes.
Yeah. And so we came up with this model of that at the base level, every person, it doesn't matter whether you don't believe there's a God or what faith you have, everybody believes in something. But those people tend to want the same things. They want to work for an organization that works well, that they think they'll be employed next year because it's a stable business and it's growing and it's healthy, can pay me well because it's profitable, and it treats me with respect. Those things transcend, and there's 100% agreement. Everybody wants that. The second level of care we call soul care. If you want to call that bottom layer kind of body, soul, and spirit, that's where we're headed. The soul care is getting more attention right now. There's an industry emerging that is providing care to employees from outside the organization, chaplaincies or secular versions of chaplaincies where people are hired just to come alongside and talk to employees and give them someone to talk to who's outside the organization. And I asked one of the CEOs who was starting these growing businesses in this industry, and I said, well, so what is it you do? And he said, well, we are friends. And we've gotten to the point with COVID and social media that people feel lonely. And so this soul care is a second layer of how do organizations to build a healthy community of workers. They have to begin to look at that person holistically, not just 8 hours at work, but be sensitive to and aware of what's affecting that person from outside. So how do you care for their families? What are things that the organization can do to show care? And it's in the biblical example, it's called the Golden Rule. Jesus taught a lot about love your neighbor as yourself. Help them. You see a need, help them. So most everybody would agree with that. They might not agree that the reason is Christian. They might think it's some other reason, but they would agree that it's good to take care of your neighbor. Now, the third level gets to be more specific to a particular faith system. In the biblical parlance, the spirit level is, the premise of Scripture is that there's something not quite right about us, that we're born with something missing. And the third level addresses sort of the gospel message that there is a way to experience and know a completeness that I can't give you. It's not from me, it's from God. But when we present those 3 layers, I presented to a business person the other day that was making a decision for their organization. And he said, we're very comfortable operating at this first level and this second level. I don't think we want to go to the third level. And so that's a purpose statement. We're not criticizing it. We'll support them in trying to operate at the level they want to operate on. But there are different strategies for each of those levels. Am I answering your question about the 3 levels?
Yes. And that's great. And just even having that freedom for people to choose to recognize, I think it's important to recognize where where they're at.
Mhm.
And it leads to my question around, and this is within the faith-based
Mhm.
industry. Obviously, if somebody is not faith-based, and that's one thing we just described.
Mhm.
But then there's also this idea of the difference between a Christian in business and building a kingdom business.
Yeah.
How do you see the difference?
Well, again, I might be a little controversial on this. We had to represent our own language and terminology, but I'll talk about my own journey. Our business was started years ago with among three Christians, and we said we wanted to honor God by the way we ran the business, and we didn't really know exactly what that meant. We're in this journey of very passionate, but not always understanding what we're passionate about. And so we always tried to take care of people. We paid for people going to marriage conferences, and we would help people if we knew about a finance situation. But what we finally realized was there's a difference between me loving you and you loving me, and what we can do for each other. There's a biblical difference between that and what God can do for you. And your whole message is about transformation, right? And what we like to make sure people understand is the gospel message is there's something God can do for you that nobody else can, and He won't do it for you unless you want it.
Yeah.
And where Christians, I think, make a mistake is we can't force that on somebody. It's totally counterproductive. The best we can do is operate at the second level and love people.
Yeah.
And then some people will stop and say, well, I've got some questions here about life and this and that and the other thing. Tell me how you think about this. That's the time to say, well, here's what God says about how to have a different relationship. You can argue it's the ultimate transformation. I was listening to one of your podcasts recently, and the woman you were talking to mentioned that whole idea of metanoia, it's called in the New Testament, change, that
Yes.
repentance and change. I've experienced that. It's amazing, and I would be a liar if I didn't want other people to know about it. But I try not to push them, but I tell them. So
Yeah.
that's kingdom impact, means doing what's necessary to invite people into the kingdom of God. That's where that word comes from.
Yeah. And what I hear in that too is the distinction between trying to be the savior and pointing
Yes.
to the savior. There's a big difference, because I
Oh, I
think
like the way you said that. Yes.
there's a lot of and it's easy to get into,
Yes.
especially nowadays, where it's like, I have the answers, I'm the guru, I've got the, I'm the leader, I have all the answers, and so I will, I will, I want to get people to follow me, versus this isn't actually about me, this is about my experience. I've had this experience, and I invite you to have this experience. And that actually is very different in
It
terms
is.
of, even on the
That
other
is,
side, is how people actually even receive it.
something that's helped me. But based on what you said, I love interacting with people who think differently than I do.
Yes.
And what can unify all of us is we're all on a quest for truth,
Yes.
right? And I'm a big believer. I would much rather interact with someone who believes something radically different than I do, but they are living with integrity to what they believe,
Yes.
because we will eventually all converge to the truth if we act on it. If we don't act on it, we'll never figure anything out,
Yeah. That's so
right?
true.
And so I would much rather talk to someone who has a radically different faith system and they're pretty intense about following it than I would talk to a Christian who doesn't care.
Yeah. That's interesting, because I've got friends of mine that are from all different faiths.
Yeah.
And, there one in particular where he just has sought deeply to seek out
Truth.
truth.
Yes.
And it's often like our conversations were so in sync and aligned, because we're both seeking the truth.
Yes.
And we, like you said, ultimately end up converging on an understanding versus someone who resists and said this is the way it is, or it should, I don't want to hear anything else, and then is closed-minded to that. That's so powerful. Yeah.
Well, I think we really hurt ourselves as a society. We'd be much stronger and healthier as a society. And instead of sort of saying we shouldn't be talking about these things, and we create this sort of emptiness in all of us, we should be inviting people to be understand what they believe and be act on it.
Yeah.
And honor each other and respect each other, but encourage people to have integrity to their faith. Then we would have a healthier society than saying, don't talk about those things here. Don't be yourself. Put that in the closet somewhere else. And
you need to think like I think. Well, and that's where a lot of wars, right? Obviously, come from, that. This is so good, Gary. We could dive in deeper into that particular we just talked about for hours, I'm sure. And we won't do that for the sake of time today, but I love this. I'm going to encourage our listeners to go get a copy of your book, Built to Beat Chaos: Biblical Wisdom for Leading Yourself and Others. Such a great book. I love your story about Wiley, the publishing company, and reaching out to you. And you initially were like, no, I'm not going to write a book. And then you're like, wait a second, they don't call people, people call them, and how this book came to be. And I love that because, you're doing it out of being in service of others, and not because you need it, but because it's in service of others. And I can tell as I'm reading it, I can tell that it is to be like, it's like a roadmap for leaders, what we need, what leaders need to know, what they need to do, and what they need to be. So thank you for that. And your website, leadfirst.ai. We'll make sure that is in the show notes as well, where they can reach out to you and learn more about what you're doing. And if there's any organizations that are out there listening that are looking to bring in a consultant to say, hey, we need to get out of chaos, or at least, better yet, that might be the thought, is to get out of chaos, but at least learn how to convert that into purpose and use those resources for good, then to reach out to you at leadfirst.ai. So any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, just an encouragement to you and everyone else. I mean, what you're doing is you're speaking but with your platform, you're speaking truth into the void, so to speak, and light conquers darkness. So I just encourage people who are kind of feeling overwhelmed, as chaos is there. Think differently about it. It's not your enemy. It's raw material. Get quiet, meditate deeply on why you're here, what you're doing. It will help you sort that out. So
awesome. Gary, thank you so very much. I appreciate you. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicole.
And thank you to our listeners and our viewers. I encourage you, I say this every week, leaders of transformation take action. There is an action that needs to be taken in order for transformation to happen. It's a choice. And sometimes that action isn't going out and doing quote unquote, doing something. It is actually stepping back and meditating, thinking, stopping and checking in to find out where you're at. And so whatever it is that throughout listening to this podcast, this episode that has struck you, I encourage you to write it down and do something about it. Take action, because that is where the transformation begins to happen. Even just exploring what do you believe to be true, and where does that come from? And you go on that path, and you're going to find answers. You're going to find answers, and it's going to be worth it. So we'd love to hear your stories. You can go on leadersoftransformation.com, reach out to us there. You can, of course, find us also on social, and we'd love to hear how this has impacted you, and also, what you're doing and how we can support you along the journey of becoming the leader of transformation that you're capable of being. So thank you again for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next week on another episode of the Leaders of Transformation.